Okay, everyone. Hi, I'm Dr. Aletha Harven, and I thank you for joining me today to talk to my friend and colleague, Dr. Aisha Lowe. This series that I have, this webinar series, is titled Transformative Conversations Promoting Equity and Inclusion in Education and Beyond. And I'm extremely excited about our guest speaker today. We are going to be discussing diversity, equity, and inclusion, what those efforts currently look like, and where we need to go with those efforts as well. And so, Dr. Lowe, hi.
Hello, hello. Good afternoon, everyone.
I know you've been in so many meetings today, so I'm very happy and grateful that you were able to squeeze me in today for an hour. For all of the attendees, be sure that as Dr. Lowe and I talk, whatever questions come to mind, you put them in the Q&A. I know a lot of times people will write in the chat, and of course I can see what's happening in the chat, but I monitor the Q&A more. So whatever questions you might have, please place them in the Q&A, and then Dr. Lowe and I, we both can see um, what your questions are. Okay, so Dr. Lowe, you are Vice Chancellor, which is really amazing at California Community Colleges. So it's such a prestigious position, one with a lot of responsibility. So one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you today is because you are a leader um, in academia, and I just wanted to hear some of your thoughts just regarding all that's happening in the world today and how that's impacting um, colleges, right? And how all of us who are leaders within or at the colleges that we're at, how we need to move forward to address all of these critical issues that we're seeing. So, what I was first hoping that we could do was talk about your educational background. I know your educational background, but I think it would be really great for the audience to um, learn a little bit more about you before we kind of get into a discussion on diversity, equity, and inclusion. But everything about you kind of speaks to that, anyways. So, yes, tell us about your education.
Yes, no, definitely. Thank you so much. Good to see you, Dr. Harvin. Elise and I go back many, many years as both colleagues and friends. So it's great to be here. So a little bit about me. It's quite interesting. My educational journey, of course, started as many people's do, but my sort of passion around equity started at a very young age. I have the rare distinction of being able to say that all of my education has happened in private institutions, right? So, though being raised by a single mother, working class background in San Francisco, California, my mother made grave sacrifices to keep me in private school because she could tell the differences. And I think it's very interesting having gone to private schools throughout my entire academic career and then noticing at a very young age the way that my private high school naturally prepared me for and funneled me into college, and that my friends, also growing up with me in San Francisco, not a single one of my close friends, went to college. And that's despite the fact that some of them actually came from two-parent households. Some of them economically were more well off than I was. And yet I noticed this interesting distinction between the type of high school I went to the public schools that they went to, and how that greatly sort of impacted our outcomes. So it just sparked something in me at a very young age of wondering why, right? Why was it that my high school was sort of naturally preparing me and transitioning me to college? And that was not the experience of some of my friends in high school. So I took that passion with me into undergrad at Stanford University, where I got my bachelor's degree in psychology. Fell in love with the study of the human mind and human functioning in an intro to psychology class many, many years ago there at Stanford. And then really started to get into research in ed psych when I was still an undergrad. So started investigating concepts that at the time were new, right, within the field around stereotype threat and a theory of intelligence, which we now call mindsets. But all of that research was brand new and developing. I had the great pleasure of being at Stanford and being under Claude Still's tutelage as stereotype threat was developing as a theory. So that also helped to frame my educational philosophy and my educational trajectory. And then took 1 year off and went back to Stanford because I loved it so much. And started my doctoral program in educational psychology, which was for me a beautiful melding of my two passions of both education and psychology, and got my doctorate at Stanford back in 2000 in ed psych. So that's my educational background, but also really how equity has been the common thread throughout that educational background.
Yes, thank you so much. It was great to hear um, what you had to say about your educational background and sharing that with the audience. I appreciate that. And let's talk about how we met because it was during our doctoral studies. So yes, you were at Stanford, I was at UCLA, and then you came to UCLA for a little bit of time. Do you want to talk about that?
Yes, yes. So Dr. Harvin and I connected back when we were PhD candidates. Uh, when I was ABD, as we say, all but dissertation, I moved to Los Angeles. Whole other story that we will not talk about, but I moved to Los Angeles for a period of time for about 1.5 years, almost 2 years. And of course, my advisor, Dr. Naila Nasir, at the time at Stanford, she then went on to become a tenured professor at Berkeley. And now I don't know if you know this, Aletha, Naila is now the president of the Spencer Foundation.
Ah,
Yes, yes. So she had gotten her doctorate at UCLA in the School of Ed, and of course, as I was moving there, she didn't want me to be without, an academic community. So she connected me with her advisor, Dr. Sandra Graham. Shouts out to Dr. Graham, so that I could be a part of, a community while I was there in Los Angeles, and that's where I got the chance to meet Dr. Harvin. Was it your first year? I guess it was from the, or what year were you when we met?
I might have been my second or third year when we met. Yeah, something like that.
So we were able to connect. I don't even remember the full story, the history, or of why we connected or what drew us together.
I do.
Okay, okay.
I won't go into a lot of detail, but you're right. I know Sandra, Dr. Graham, you're right. A shout out to her. She connected the two of us. So I remember
That's right.
she told me who you were, and so she made sure we connected. And then you also came to our RAC,
Yes.
the RAC meetings, our research meetings. And so yeah, you and I just hit it off and started a friendship. And
No, very true. Because we were also, our research was in the same area. I remember that. We were interested in some of the same concepts within our research. So we started off as colleagues in research, finishing our doctoral programs, and then have now been friends for what has it been, over 20 years? My goodness. Yeah.
wait, you're really aging us. Hold on. I don't know if it's been that long. It's been a long friendship, but you said 20 years? What?
Well, almost. It's
Okay,
2020.
what are you
We'll say almost 20 years. We're not here yet, but
I'm
we're
gonna have to do the math on that.
we're getting closer.
No, stop. Okay, well, I'm definitely happy that we've been friends for a long time. I'm gonna go back and do the math. Maybe.
I think it was 2003, so not quite 20 years, but we're close.
It's been a long time, Dr. Lowe. Okay, so well, let's talk about your career, right? Prior to this position. I've known you as a research analyst, as a teacher, as you just had various positions, and they've all been within the educational realm. So, just this leadership position that you have right now, it makes sense that you have this position because of everything that you've done leading up to it. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that? Like once you graduated with your PhD?
Yes, definitely, definitely. So, as Dr. Harvin said, entire career in education, again, realized fairly young that that was my passion. that this was the area where I wanted to commit my life and commit my career to education, and specifically to this topic of equity, right? How do we make sure that your outcomes are not determined by the quality of the school that you're going to, right? Or by your socioeconomic status or your zip code. It's just a fire and a passion that was lit in me fairly young. So of course, the career meandered into various and sundry places, all still with sort of that guiding thread of equity. So the first half of my career was really on the K-12 side. When I went back to Stanford to get my doctorate, the goal at the time was, I think my vision was that I would start a charter school, and that I would do some direct service work with low income students to give them the kind of education I felt like I had the privilege of receiving. And so I jumped into the PhD studies with that goal and with that aim. So interestingly, might seem a little backwards, but after getting my doctorate, then I went to go teach in the K-12 system. I had had a long history throughout undergrad, and even after undergrad, of working in nonprofit organizations, working with low income students, in particular when I was at Stanford with youth from East Palo Alto, which had given me some opportunity to teach sort of non-traditionally in after school programs, summer programs. But as I thought about the role that I wanted to play of being a leader within education, it felt essential to me at the time that I actually understood what was the experience of the K-12 teacher. What did that really look and feel like on a day-to-day basis? And while I had read about it, while I understood it at some level because I had run classrooms in these non-traditional ways, I felt like I really needed to walk in the teacher's shoes so that I could fully understand that experience. So I signed up to be a fifth grade science and social studies teacher at Kit Bayview Academy in San Francisco, a small middle school charter school that starts fifth grade. So it was a fifth through eighth school. So I could really walk in those shoes. And my goodness, I tell people to this day, hands down, one of the most challenging things I've ever done was be a K-12 teacher. Nothing, well, actually, this job might rival it. But until this job, I've always said nothing has required me to be so on. Right? Nothing has required me to be so present and so on literally every moment of the day as you're watching fifth graders. Right. And so you're managing their movement, their behavior. You're also conveying content and doing the work to keep them engaged. So it was a challenging year, but it was a very fulfilling year. Loved my experience working with my fifth graders. I'm Facebook friends with a number of them to this day. Speaking of aging us, as I watch my fifth graders get married with children, I'm feeling really old these days. But it was a great experience. And at the time, though, it was definitely challenging in general. I think being a K-12 teacher, but in particular, being at the charter school I was at, we had a pretty strenuous, I would say, schedule, right? We were present at 7 a.m. And started homeroom, I think, at 7:45 a.m. We didn't dismiss the kids until 5 p.m. And during that time, I had moved and got married and various things that made it difficult to stay. And so I then transitioned to the California Charter Schools Association, spent, I think, 4 or 5 years there, I believe 5 years, as their director of research and evaluation. As you said, started there as a research analyst and worked my way to director of research and evaluation. And you and I got to have some interactions there as well. And so that was really a great opportunity. It sort of catapulted me from this initial point in my career that was very focused on direct service, be it in nonprofit programs or in the classroom, and it catapulted me into sort of this system level leadership. What does it mean to really holistically research and assess a system, right, and understand that process? And so that was great learning for me. And a great time of really understanding deeply the K-12 system, all of our metrics and assessments, and in particular within that position, really analyzing from a data and research perspective, what were the strengths and the weaknesses of the California charter school system. I then transitioned from there into a bit of policy work. That's what brought me to the Sacramento region, where I continue to live now. So spent some time at a small nonprofit, Stand Up for Sacramento Schools, really focused on policy and advocacy work. And then I started to miss being with students, very much missing that direct interaction. So I transitioned to a small private university here in the Sacramento region, William Jessup University. Had an opportunity to teach there in their School of Education, as well as serve of their coordinator of research within the School of Ed, primarily focused on teaching and training future K-12 teachers. And then when I left there, was also Dean of the Office of Academic Research, so overseeing faculty grant making, faculty academic research. And then that landed me here, now at the Chancellor's office. I'm in a great leadership team of a number of vice chancellors. I'm not the only one. We have a couple of different divisions and vice chancellors over those divisions. So I'm a vice chancellor over educational services and support, in particular, our academic affairs unit, which is all things academic affairs for the California community colleges. We have 116 colleges. We have 73 different districts. We serve 2.1 million students. So we are the largest higher education institution system within the nation. So it is no small task, hence why I am in meetings literally all day, every day. Because there's only a few of us. Interestingly, our agency, we're fairly small to have such a large system that we're working with. So that's what brings me here. And what really attracted me to this opportunity was our current chancellor, who has a very strong equity agenda in our vision for success. And the ways in which we as a leadership are unapologetic and courageous about that focus on equity is really what attracted me to this position and this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lowe. Just, I think all that you've experienced throughout your journey with your career and your education has just been amazing. And you and I both, we've been able to watch each other over the years, the many years that we've known each other, and it's just great to see where you're at this point and all the work that you're doing. And you have always been such a leader in all positions that you've been in. So this is really exciting. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So you said that your chancellor kind of courageously, right, pushes forward an agenda um, regarding equity and inclusion. Um, what do you think makes a courageous leader? You know?
No, that's great. Definitely. Our chancellor, Eloy Ortiz Oakley, is a phenomenal leader. And in particular, as I said, what attracted me to this opportunity to be here was the unapologetic focus on equity. And I think when I think about what it means to be a courageous leader, that really what comes to mind, right? The type of leader who's willing to put a stake in the ground, right? Who's willing to put a stake in the ground about what is necessary, what is required, and do that in a way where naturally you're bringing your constituent groups along, you're having those difficult conversations, you're sort of planting a vision and helping people to take it on as their own, but at the same time, being courageous to sort of say, you know, this is who we are. This is who we're going to be. These are the things that we're going to do. And then moving your entire system along to focus in those areas and to meet those goals. So for the vision for success that has come under Chancellor Oakley's leadership, we really are seeing some very clear SMART goals, right? Goals that are measurable and quantifiable about the ways in which we need to move this system forward to start to see the outcomes that we want to see, and setting goals specific to student completion, setting goals specific to student transfer, setting goals around student employability after they leave our system, as well as setting specific goals around closing racial achievement gaps, as well as regional gaps that have historically persisted in our system. And so to me, that's courageous, right? As a leader, when whatever it is that's under your purview, you can do those hard assessments of what is not working and set some clear goals and objectives for making changes in those areas. And then, you know, of course, I think also getting the right people on your team to then start doing the hard daily work of actually moving forward to fulfill those goals and those objectives.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. I agree with you. I was taking notes as you were talking, you know, just about what a courageous leader looks like. And I agree with you. It's about having the difficult conversations, but just also going beyond that, right? And like you were saying, you can't improve unless you're willing to
Mm-hmm.
engage in a real assessment, a real authentic assessment on what's working, what's not working, right? And just moving forward in an unapologetic way toward equity. So I really did like that. Okay, thank you so much. Okay, can you hear me better now?
Yes, there's moments when it's a little harder to hear you. So I think you just have to lean in.
Thank you. I'm leaning in right now. Okay, so let me see. Based on what you said, what I had this question by an audience member. I remember in a different webinar that I held, and it was about the racial achievement gap. And you and I both study the racial achievement gap. I mean, that's been a huge part of both of our careers for so long. Uh, why do you think this racial achievement gap still exists, right? Because it's like we've been talking about it for years, year after year. There's a racial achievement gap. We need to close it. Well, why does it still exist, right? So, what do you think is happening, particularly at the college level?
Oh, such a great question. Why does this gap still exist? I think there is a number of factors. So I think one of the reasons why we see these gaps persist is because we do not understand the ways in which our institutional cultures perpetuate those gaps, right? So we don't understand the ways in which our policies, procedures, our structure, even our curriculum helps to perpetuate and sustain those gaps. And so I think part of the work that's before us in higher ed is how do we start to interrogate those policies, procedures, structures, right, and curriculum to really ask those hard questions about are we doing these things in ways that disadvantage certain students or advantage other students, right? Are we doing things in ways that are a misalignment with the cultural background of some of our students, right? So I think there's an examination of ourselves and our practices that we don't necessarily naturally do, and that we often have not been forced to do in order to really unpack and interrogate those key elements of our functioning as institutions, and then be explicit and again courageous about changing them, right? Making those changes. So, perfect example, when I think in higher ed about, we have so many programs that exist to assist students if they're low income, to assist students if they are parents, right? To assist students who've come out of foster care or whatever the case may be. We have all these programs. And yet, often, not always, but often, as students are applying to receive this help, we often make them jump through a lot of hoops,
Mhm.
right? In some ways, we have criminalized poverty, and it becomes this process of prove to me that you're poor, right? Prove to me that you deserve these supports and these help and this help. And I don't think we think about the way that that impacts students. I don't think we think about the ways that might disincentivize students from even wanting to bother of going through all of our processes and jumping through all of our hoops.
Mhm.
There's ways in which we, I believe, inadvertently, unintentionally actually put up barriers to students accessing the helps and the support that they need, just as one example. So it's about us starting to unpack and interrogate, well, why do we require this verification or that verification? Is that actually necessary? Uh, to whose benefit is that for? And is it for the benefit of our students? And I think we have to start to interrogate all of our practices, policies, and procedures. And we also have to tear down the places where we've determined that certain things are off limits, right? And I know this is a difficult one in particular in higher ed, right? But I feel free saying it because I'm a previous faculty member, right? I think in particular as faculty, we're going to have to allow some room and some space for things that we have held sacred that cannot be touched, right? We see the classroom as our purview, and that there's no room for any interrogation into what is happening into our classrooms. We are very big in higher ed on faculty freedom. But I think we need to balance that with, faculty freedom can never be at the expense of what's best for our students. So how do we create some balance around instituting ways for us to interrogate what is happening in the classroom? Are we creating classroom environments of acceptance and belonging where students feel welcomed and where their whole self, including their racial self, feels welcome in those environments? And if we're not, what is it that we need to do, right? Perhaps faculty need more training in those areas of understanding the psychological environment of the classroom and the ways in which they need to intentionally build environments of acceptance and belonging for students. Are students reflected in our curriculum? Are we only providing Eurocentric voices within our texts and our articles and our examples? Right? How do we start to interrogate our curriculum and the text that we use and really not just suggest, but I know people hate to hear this, but require that that be a part of the curricular development process, that there needs to be diversity of text, diversity of voices when you're designing a curriculum that's for a diverse body of students. So I think that's part of what's going on. The other part of what's going on, frankly, sadly, I think is more of a heart and mind issue. You know, when I reflect on the civil rights movement and the advances that were made, and then the advances that were not made, despite all that went into the civil rights movement, you know, I always come back to, well, you can't legislate the hearts and minds of people, right? You can't legislate hearts and minds. So there's certainly things that we need to do in terms of improving policy, procedure, practice, curriculum. But then there's also that deeper sort of heart work that has to be done of, do you truly see all students as highly capable? Because I think what we don't understand, right? You and I understand this well, being educational psychologists, right? And having studied education from a psychological perspective, what we believe about our students will show up. It will show up in our practices, it will show up in our policies and procedures, and it will ultimately show up in their outcomes. So, do we actually believe that all students can learn and achieve at high levels? Do we actually believe as educators that it's our responsibility to make sure that happens and that their failure is our failure? Right. So, I feel like there's also some ideological, right, and philosophical places where we really need to push on our systems and on the educators within our systems to really start to transition mindsets while we also work on interrogating and improving our policies, procedures, and practices.
Thank you so much for what you said. You mentioned how the classroom tends to be off limits. You're right. It's totally off limits typically, for professors who are on tenure tracks or they are tenured. Um, and just thinking of what you were saying about heart work, right? Because you can have anyone say to you, of course I care about all students, but if they don't have that deep belief, that all students, for instance, all Black students can learn.
Mhm.
Black students are smart, right? Um, if they don't really believe that, if people don't believe that, you're right, it totally shows up. And I don't think people fully understand that sometimes.
Mhm.
Like it shows up in everything that you're doing in the classroom. And like sometimes with the research that I conduct, I might have a teacher who says, well, I'm not racist, right? But then the students, a majority of the students have said, no, this person is racist.
Mhm.
The teacher keeps saying, but I'm not racist. But I have to sit down like, with that educator and say, hey, you know what? If the students are saying this, let's explore and see what's really going on. Because you can think you're not racist all day long, but if you have a classroom full of students who are calling you out and complaining to the principal or to whomever, about your behavior, then you have to take a deeper look at yourself. Like you said,
Mhm.
hard work is really important in interrogating our own beliefs and our mindsets.
Right. So that self interrogation also. And I think a lot of that is also right around the things we often talk about in this equity work. It's a lot of it is about implicit bias, right? Because, an educator in that position is thinking to themselves, I don't have overt racist thoughts about, Black students or Latinx students or whoever the group might be, but it's so much more subtle and much more insidious than that, right? It can be the assumptions and conclusions that we reach about students from that certain high school, right? Or who come from that certain neighborhood, right? So it may not be explicitly focused on race, but there's always those correlations and those connections typically with race as well as socioeconomic status, right? So it can be very subtle. And I think that's actually the harder work. I do believe that we are in a place within our nation. Certainly, we're doing this within the California Community College system, where given the events that have taken place this year, the numerous murders of unarmed African American citizens that we have seen, and the public response and the outcry at a level, frankly, we have not seen in the past. I do think that's sort of pressing on us to be more intentional about this work. And I do think we will start to see institutions leaning into that first work that I talked about, right? Interrogating policies, practices, procedures, curriculum. But there is that other level of work of doing the self-interrogation work, reading the books, right? Engage in the trainings to unpack your own biases, because we all have biases. And frankly, Aletha, I think that would help. I think we have to eliminate the stigma around the reality of holding biases. You and I know this because we study psychology. Holding bias is a natural human reaction to our tendency within our human brains to categorize things, right? It just is. We have a natural tendency as human beings to categorize things as like and different. And we have a natural tendency as human beings to categorize things in association to ourselves, what is like me and what is different from me. And so the biases that we hold as human beings, they're natural. It's a natural part of the way our brains function. It's a natural part of growing up and of being socialized in the very diverse environments that we often are within the United States. So I think we need to normalize it, right? That no one's pointing the finger at you and saying, oh, you're this hateful, racist person. No, it's more of you're the victim of a natural process of the way the brain interprets and processes information. And depending on what you've been exposed to or not exposed to and the experiences that you've had, you may have been infected, right, with some of these implicit biases, right? And it's going to show up in your practice. It's going to show up ultimately in your students' outcomes. And so how do we start to normalize that so we can make people more comfortable with having those difficult conversations?
I agree with you on normalizing the idea that we all have biases, because you're right, just from our studies, like you said, we know that from the time we're born, from the moment we're born, we are categorizing, we are
Mhm.
processing information in that way because it's our way to make sense of the world. Babies do it. We grow up, we're constantly doing it. And like you said, depending on how we're socialized and what we're exposed to, um, the way we're categorizing information can, especially about people, right? We know that that can turn into something really negative, right?
Mhm.
So, thank you. And then you did mention, was it you were talking about what was happening in the world, like the racial unrest that's going on right now, and how so many colleges, and it does look like a lot of college leaders are being very intentional in trying to address, um, the racism that we're clearly seeing, right? And I know anti-Black racism, that's been something I've been working on confronting and helping people to confront. But yeah, everyone, or not everyone, but it does seem like a number of people are being very intentional about it. So how do you, like, what are your feelings on the current efforts, in relation to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the racial unrest, and how people are scrambling to try to do something? What are some of your feelings surrounding what you're seeing, what you're witnessing?
Yeah, well, I'm glad to see the focus, right? I was very surprised, but pleasantly surprised to see the reaction that sort of moved across the nation to see these beautiful, sort of multi-ethnic groups of individuals coming together all across the nation, marching, really supporting the notion of Black Lives Matter, really confronting the issue, of police brutality, and to see that happening in such a diverse coalition, I thought it was definitely refreshing to see that, and to see that now reverberating beyond just the issue of, the criminal justice system, and really reverberating across our systems, right? That we're having conversations about what does that mean in education, that we're having conversations about, well, what is medical racism, which is another very real thing, and what does that mean about the way that we are training those in the medical field, as well as how we're training police and first responders. So I'm excited to see the focus. I'm excited to see the conversations. I think what we'll need now, though, is action, right? So I think there's been an important sort of shedding of light on a situation that not everyone in the country perhaps was aware of or in tune to, and I think that's a great first step. I grew up watching GI Joe, right? And what was the slogan in GI Joe, right? Knowing is half the battle, right? So I am excited to see that the knowing is happening, but the real work is still before us, which is the doing, right? It is one thing to know, and this moment could pass us by with a lot of rhetoric and platitudes, right? And I hope that doesn't happen. To me, that would not at all be a success if we just have a lot of talk around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and what needs to be done, but don't actually do it. But I'm hopeful because I'm seeing, at least within education and certainly within the California community college system, I'm seeing leaders lean into this in ways that we don't traditionally see. And I'm seeing leaders lead into this in a way where they're having the difficult conversations with their own constituency groups, right? And they're not waiting for us to lead the effort. They're picking up the mantle and leading it themselves. And then we have a long history within our system of equity champions who have been beating this drum for decades, right? And so I'm appreciating the opportunity for their work to finally fully be acknowledged and received in terms of the work that has been going on behind the scenes for decades as people, and particularly as leaders and faculty of color, have been trying to move forward diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives for many years. So I'm very hopeful. What I sense in talking to the leaders and faculty within our system is what's needed now is the expertise and the guidance in that area, right? So I think what this moment in time has afforded for us is a softening of the heart, right? And an openness to having these conversations, and openness to tackling these issues, and a willingness that we perhaps have not had historically. But where this is going to fall flat is if there is not the needed sort of guidance, expertise, and support in helping educators to navigate what do I actually do now, right? Because I'm seeing willing hearts, but there's a lack of expertise, right? If this is not something that you have researched or studied or spent a lot of time reading up on, as scholars like you and I have done, I do sense that leaders do feel a sort of a sense of frustration and a sense of ineptitude, that they've now agreed that this is important, they're open, they're willing, they want to move things forward, but they don't know what to do. They don't, we tell them you need to interrogate your policies and practices, and I think we do have leaders wondering, well, what does that mean, right? What does that mean for me to interrogate those things? Can you provide me with frameworks and tools and ways to sort of guide me in doing that difficult work? So I think that's what we really need. And I think scholars like yourself, Dr. Harvin, who are engaged in this work, there's a gap to be filled here of how do we create toolkits, frameworks, professional development, et cetera, so that we can really help our educational institutions, I would say both K-12 and higher ed, on how do you actually implement the changes that we're saying need to take place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly. And like you said, you and I have been doing this work for a long time. We have been studying it for so long. So it's really easy for us to say, okay, this is how you do it. This is how you interrogate the policies. This is how you, develop the curriculum. So it's very easy for us to do it. But you're right, there are many people who don't have the same level of expertise. And you're right, that's really what's going to take us to the next level, is getting the experts in, having the guides, having the support in place. What's really interesting, given what you just said, I have this grant, this National Science Foundation grant, and our program, our acronym is Ciencia. And so we have purposely focused on like the College of Science at my university, a few colleagues and I, or a handful of colleagues and I. And what we are doing is we're focusing on, you know, helping to guide faculty and just working with faculty. We're all collaborating together, to ensure that our classes are inclusive, to ensure that the way that, the curriculum is being developed and how the information is being delivered to students is in a way that is supportive of students, that makes students feel cared for, that makes them feel welcome. So I know that, our grant really focuses on this particular effort. And so you're right. I think, there just needs to be more and more of this type of work being done to help across the college campus, right? Just not within the classroom, but also, like you said, just anyone who's working with students, staff members, just everyone.
No, so true. I'm glad to hear you all are focusing on the sciences. It's such a key area where we see so many of these gaps persisting, and have seen intractable, and also just about the whole campus. It's so true. Because it's also about what is the welcome, what is the experience when I walk into the financial aid office, or I walk into the registrar, or those various places on campus. It really is about that holistic experience. And I think one thing that I'm not quite sure I would want to investigate historically, were we never of this mindset in higher ed, or did we shift away from this mindset in higher ed at some point? But I know what has been of interest to me, having spent some years now on various college campuses, is how do we take on an ethos of customer service and care, right? Why do we not see our students as customers and clients, and that our role is to serve them and to serve them well? So I think that's another frontier for us, just as we think about how we hire, how we orient, and how we train across the college campus community. To your point, right, of the offices students are going to work in. What is our messaging in hiring and in orientation and training to staff, right, across our campuses about what their role is, and how do we start to infuse this messaging of we are here to serve, right? Our students are our primary customer and client, and we're here to serve them. And so I just feel like that will completely shift the way that we're welcoming students on our campus, and the experience that they ultimately have, because the research clearly shows all of those things matter for academic outcomes, right? And we have to understand that and get that as educators. What we talk about in ed psych is the psychological environment of a place has a massive impact on your students' motivation. It has a massive impact on students' persistence. In particular, there's persistence in the face of challenge. It has a massive impact ultimately on their academic outcomes. And so that focus on the psychological environment of our offices, of our campus, everything, of our parking lots, right? Of our students' interactions with campus police, of our students' interaction with faculty and advisors and counselors. All of those are important cogs in this broader machine of creating an environment that really does support a student psychologically and emotionally. So I think the key point we often miss in higher ed, perhaps because we're working with adults, I'm not sure, but we often miss this point about the humanness, right? And the humaneness of our students, and that we have to sort of serve and speak to their heart needs before we can focus in on their head needs, right? Or their intellectual needs.
Yes, absolutely. I 100% agree with you. So thank you so much for that, Dr. Lowe. I love how you continue to talk about the holistic experience and focusing on the heart, not only in terms of how educators and staff members and our academic leaders are even thinking about, our students, but also in terms of, like you said, how we are interacting with students, right? It all is about, you know, understanding that our students are human too, just like
Yeah.
us, and everyone deserves grace. Everyone needs grace.
Yeah.
Yeah, and understanding. So yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. So with the time that we have left, Dr. Lowe, I wanted to go ahead and get to questions. So again, everyone, if you have questions for Dr. Lowe, please place them in the Q&A. So there is a question here. What are some of the specific practices regarding equity that have made the biggest impacts for students and faculty and staff?
Oh, that is such a great question. I'm going to start off by honestly saying, I don't know if we've cracked that open, right? I think that's the moment in time that we are in. We do have so much more research, I want to say, on the K-12 side,
Yeah.
right? About what some of those more specific practices are, the ways in which you teach math or teach English. And there's been, I feel, a deeper dive in the literature, at least on the K-12 side, on really figuring out what those practices are. I think this is an area of growth for us in higher ed, is really starting to investigate what are the specific practices and even policies and procedures that are then correlated with, or even better yet, sort of predict student outcomes. Now, we do have some research in that area, and similar to what we see on the K-12 side, relationships are essential. I'm thinking of some research, I'm forgetting the exact terminology, but it's a set of research that really looks at what helps college students thrive. And one of the things that they talk about in that research is the essential role of relationships with faculty, as they looked at various factors that might impact students, relationships with peers, being involved in extracurricular activities on campus, various elements that they looked at, right, doing a regression, looking at some predictions. One of the things that they found to be highly predictive of students' persistence as well as student success are those faculty relationships, right? Could students say that there was at least one faculty member on campus that they felt comfortable approaching, that they felt they had built a rapport with, and that they trusted, and that they believed the faculty member cared about them? And it was so telling to me, not surprising to me, but again, one of those great ahas of yes, right? This is about relationships. And we have to remember our students are people, and students have to remember, I told my students often, you have to remember faculty are people, right? And that this is actually a relationship that's taking place as you're interacting between faculty and students. So we know that's a core factor, but I think there's so much more for us still to learn in terms of really detailed practicality around curricular structures, around the way that we design the teaching and learning journey, um, around the type of supports that seem to best help students to persist and to complete and to do well. So I definitely think it's an area where we need to dig a little deeper in higher ed to better understand what some of those practices are.
Mhm. Thank you so much. Great response. So here's another question. What suggestions do you have for fostering the relationships between faculty and students in the current online environment? And you know what? I was just about to ask you similar questions, so this is great that was posed.
Now, this is a huge one, right? We know this transition to online is, well, time will tell, right? I don't think we really know yet what the impact has been. We're going to need to research it to understand. But that piece around how do you still develop relationship and rapport in that environment? We know that it's possible. It does require more work, right, to do that. But I don't want to act like it's extremely different than in person. So I had the great distinctive in March, even though I joined the chancellor's office in March, I was teaching at the time. I was teaching 3 courses at my local community college, where I've taught adjunct for about 8 years now, and I had to transition my 3 courses to online, right, in the midst of this pandemic and everything else that was taking place. And so what I really focused on was how do I transition those good practices that I was engaging in the classroom into an online environment. And it can be done. Now for faculty members, it's a bit more work, right? So it's, what we know from the research is so much of it is actually small things, right? It's sort of the culmination of a bunch of little small things that help to create this environment with your students. And I think what one thing I will recommend um, is the AQ training for faculty, the ACUE training for faculty. I need to look up what the whole acronym is, but it's basically training for higher ed faculty with various modules which talk about diversity, but a lot of it is focused on that relationship and how you build those environments. And it's those small little things. How do we as faculty, how do you open yourself up to your students, right? So where are the places where you feel comfortable sharing and giving the students a view into who you are as a person, right? Your history, your past, your life, and then providing them opportunities to do the same, whether that's in discussion posts or having them get into small groups and doing that together. But I think a lot of what we see in the literature are ways in which we address within the classroom the broader human experience beyond just the specific content that we're conveying. And how do we make room and make space to have those connections and make those connections? We know that building those strong classroom environments, a lot of that is around those opportunities for students to interact with one another as well as with the faculty members. We can replicate that online, it's just a bit more work. But with the technology that we have now, right, we can still break our students into small groups with the breakout rooms that we have within Zoom. Even though we can't do it perhaps standing in front of the class, you could still create, an intro video introducing yourself, telling students a little bit about who you are, similar to what we did at the start of this, your educational background and what your passions are, and the things, maybe what your hobbies are and things that you're involved in, and then have an assignment where students also create a little video. Or even if you're just doing in writing, where you do a written introduction to yourself and then have students respond. So it's all those little ways in which we create these opportunities for interaction and connection. And I think key within that, whether we're in person or we're online, is also about the relevance of the curriculum, right? We know the research clearly shows that's essential. If you want students to really engage, you have to think through, you have to figure out how do you make this content relevant to their lives, relevant to things they're hearing on the news, relevant to current events, right? Relevant to their individual lives. And so I think part of that for us as faculty is getting to know our students. So one thing I always did in every class I have taught is had my students fill out a survey that was asking them some questions about sort of their career aspirations, their academic goals, what they wanted to get out the class, but then also ask them questions about, what are you carrying right now? I have questions that might even be multiple choice of, well, I've got 12 or more units. I have small children, right? I'm also working. So I could get a sense of who they are and understanding them better. And then would always have these opportunities with open-ended questions for, is there anything you want me to know about you, right? Is there anything that you're struggling with that you're afraid might get in the way of you being successful this semester? Just all of those ways that we can turn this exchange into a person-to-person exchange, I think is essential. And then I think transferring that to online is really just about us being creative about how do we replicate some of those experiences in a digital environment.
Mhm. Thank you so much. That was such a great and thorough response. And we're actually kind of out of time. We have just a few minutes left, but in these few minutes, I wanted to read what Terry wrote here in the chat. Thank you so much, Dr. Lowe and Dr. Harvin, for this meeting. Dr. Lowe, this is the second time I have had the pleasure to hear you speak. In fact, I quoted you in my thesis from our last meeting. Oh, that's really cool. I wish I could have added the information I have heard on my thesis. Great information. So I think that's a really nice way to kind of end things. And
That's awesome. Thank you, Terry.
Yes. And I just wanted to see if you had any, um, last words for all of us, as we move forward in this just really critical work, and especially in this current climate, right? In supporting our students. Is there anything else you want to say to
Yeah, I think I would just say it's so funny. What I was saying to you around your microphone, lean in,
us?
right? We have got to lean in. I know it is difficult, it is tiring. This whole transition, right? We also have to be very cognizant of the fact that we as educators, we're stressed right now. We're pressed, right? We're all locked up in our houses like like prisoners, and we're staring at these screens all day. And we're in many ways ourselves, our energy is being depleted by not having the opportunity to engage with our students the way we normally do, or engage with our colleagues the way we normally do. These are very challenging times, and yet we're being asked to step up, right? And to do even more so that we can transform our institutions to be what they could be, right? What they have the potential to be. So I think my encouragement to everyone would be to lean in, that whatever your role is, to think about what role can I play given whatever position I hold to start to make changes in this important area of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So whether you're faculty, whether you're an administrator, whether you're staff, whatever it may be, to think about your sphere of influence, right? And how are you going to be that catalytic influence for change? And how do you just start to lead in this area? I would say to everyone, again, lean in. Don't wait for anyone to give you permission. Lean into your sphere of influence and start to think about, how can I interrogate policies, procedures, practices that are under my purview that I'm utilizing? How do I start to make recommendations and suggestions, even if I'm not the one in the position of power? How do I start to sort of push forward some of the changes that I know that we need to make? And then how do I make sure that anytime a student is interacting with me, they're going to feel welcome, they're going to feel like they belong, they're going to feel my love and care for them, and that I'm going to do the best that I can to really assist them for whatever reason they've come to me. So I think it's those things, right? Our personal responsibility to be those kind and loving educators that our students need, and then our professional responsibility to start to push the envelope, to start requests and recommending changes that we know, because we know, right? We've been watching it for years. We know where things are inequitable. So that bravery to be courageous, to lean in, and to start to push for change in whatever sphere of influence that you hold.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lowe. And I
My
love the
pleasure.
idea. Yeah, I love the idea of leaning in. I'm always saying that too, leaning in. You've got to lean in, and you're right. And you just have to be courageous with this type of work. I know for some people it can be really scary, but I think about, how you and we've always been engaged in this work, and it's like we've always had to be courageous, and we've always had to move forward and make our voices heard. And so that's just part of the experience. And I think for some people, if they just lean in, like you said, to their sphere of influence, that might be a great place to start, and just do what you can and then kind of build from there. So I appreciate you being here, of course. I really enjoyed having you. And our time is up, everyone. I do want to tell you that. And so we'll go ahead and end the webinar. Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Lowe. I appreciate you being here.
No, this was awesome. Always great to see you, friend. And of course, we need to catch up soon on non-work related things. But
I know. I know. My mind was going elsewhere for a minute there. I was like, wait, no, that's not it. So no, it's totally good to see you. It always is. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
and thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Okay, bye.
Bye, everyone.